Solange is here as well. She's not boring. She's going to tell us about lots of interesting things happening in the newspapers. You're starting off, aren't you, Solange, with the EU and the US imposing sanctions on China. This is over Beijing's treatment of the Uyghurs and, let's not forget, other Muslim minorities as well.
Yeah, and the Washington Post tells us, their editorial board, to be more precise, tells us that the Biden administration is doing exactly what it should be doing in regard to joining the EU in sanctioning China. Now, they say this is a coordinated reset, and it is exactly what was needed to show that, quote, democracy can still prevail. But for the French opinion paper L'Opinion, they wonder if the Biden administration's strategy is going too fast in its bloody nose strategy, they call it, or hit hard first and then open talks. Now, their illustrator CAC questions if Biden may be taking too many steps at a time as his administration tackles resetting relations with China and with Russia. Again, this is pointing to Biden's real stumbles going up steps on Air Force One a few days ago.
Yeah, in regard to sanctions coming from Europe, how's the press covering that, Solange?
Well, Politico tells us that one of the potential victims of the Europe's sanctions is the EU-China trade deal. Relations have so quickly nosedived that Beijing's hardliners, or their wolf warriors, are willing to impose their own sanctions and potentially sacrifice the trade deal. For Beijing, this isn't about concentration camps in Xinjiang, as it is for the US and for the EU. It is about their internal affairs being meddled with by outside powers. And for the government-backed Global Times, the EU's sanctions may be symbolic, but, quote, they are vicious in nature, and they merited counter-sanctions. And the paper headlines a rapprochement with Russia to counterbalance US hegemony.
Let's go to Australia for this next story. Floodwaters there are continuing to rise. Evacuations continuing as well. Already some 18,000 people have been evacuated from their homes.
Yeah, and arachnophobes, beware, turn your eyes away. People aren't the only ones who are trying to escape the rising waters. As the Australian site The New Daily explains, there have been thousands, potentially millions of spiders trying to make it to higher ground, and they are not the only ones hightailing it to houses. There are tons of other insects of all kinds climbing trees, poles, and boats trying to escape, the site says. Now, the extent of the flooding may be due to climate change, but there is also the issue of development in the wrong places. The Guardian argues in an op-ed that until New South Wales stops building in floodplain areas and redesigns Western Sydney to be more water conscious, well, they say the burden to protect people will be on the government.
Sticking with the environment, there's some bad news. This is for men and what pollution is doing to them.
We've long talked about the role pollution has on fertility, but now Vice tells us that the effect could actually be sizable, as in the size of things. As in, pollution is literally shrinking not just men's sperm counts, women's fertility, but the actual size of men's penises. And if you aren't well endowed, well, you can blame it on your grandparents and your parents, or rather that the more exposure you have to such pollutants, well, you're likely going to pass those on from generation to generation, for these are, as they are called, forever chemicals. That is, unless this article inspires some men and women to not get it on, but get on it when it comes to reducing chemicals in their lifestyles.
I have no idea what that picture of vegetables and fruit has to do with this story, but anyway. Lifestyle changes, anyway, and how cities change with the times is actually what this next story about. It's about Paris bidding farewell to rather a Paris institution.
Yeah, the New York Times tells us that the yellow awning Giberjean bookstores in the Latin Quarter of Paris are going out of business after over a century in the neighborhood. The paper says that the shuttering is part of a long trend in the 5th and 6th arrondissements. It is too expensive for most Sorbonne students, let alone most Parisians, to live there. But now with COVID, high rents, cheaper books online, well, this is part of Paris is, according to the Times, taking one step closer to being more a wonderland for tourists, Airbnb flats, and the uber wealthy as well.
Yeah, same shame to see it going. And speaking of the uber wealthy, Solange has found an article. This is about some bling in perhaps some surprising places.
Yeah, have you ever desired a pair of $5,000 sneakers?
No.
Well, don't. Neither have I. But you don't need to be a lawyer, a doctor, investment banker. Go into preaching, or don't if the money's coming from the wrong places. This article is about the fine line between the gospel and business in the United States and how fashion has become a symbol of that messy relationship. The Washington Post tells us about Ben Kirby, who noticed that a preacher was wearing sneakers that cost nearly his entire rent check. And so as a joke, he began an Instagram site called Preachers in Sneakers. And now it has over 200,000 followers. And the site follows the fashion and the cost of what American religious leaders are wearing. And according to Kirby, he does this to make sure that there is more accountability over where the money from the poor box goes.
They even look like army boots as well,
Yeah,
those
they're nice.
sneakers. Not particularly good.
Not
are
my
they?
taste.
No, anyway, Solange has got much better taste than that. Solange Mougin with the papers on France 24.